Hi everyone, welcome to Season 6 of Undercurrents. We're kicking off this exciting new season by sitting down with a friend and MCC colleague who, by the time you hear this episode, will be finishing his time with MCC and indeed throwing off the yoke of the 40-hour work week altogether and shifting into a well-deserved retirement. More in my conversation with fly fisherman, peace teacher, and the man who came up with the name for this podcast, Rod Friesen, in just a few minutes. Undercurrents is sponsored in part by Kindred Credit Union. Kindred helped to get Undercurrents off the ground back in 2020 and have been a faithful supporter ever since. And lest you think that I'm one of those podcasters who only raves about a sponsor after they've become a sponsor, I will have you know that I've been a member of Kindred for nearly 30 years, starting way back when Mary Lou Gingrich helped me open my first checking account. Shout out Mary Lou. Kindred is all about helping you make peace with your money through real human advice and by using money as a force for good in your community. How many banks can say that? Go to kindredcu.com to open an account today. Relief, development, and peace in the name of Christ. That's MCC's mission in a single sentence. For many of us, the relief and development parts are easier to understand. A relief kit to a family whose home was washed away in a flood? Great. Show me where I can pack a kit. A small grant to a farmer to help her learn new farming techniques to adapt to the effects of climate change? Amazing. Where do I make my donation? But peace, what does that mean? What does it look like? And how do we get there? A 30-second scroll through your headlines will give you a glimpse of a world desperately in need of peace. But peacebuilding is not only needed in places like Palestine and Israel, or the Ukraine, or in South Sudan. Peace is needed right here at home. In my conversation with Rod, he shares 3 stories of peacebuilding from his career, and I think we can learn something from each of these stories and apply them in our own lives.
So you're going to do a lot of splicing, I would think.
I'll do a ton of splicing. Rod has served at MCC in Ontario for 8 years, first leading the restorative justice program and then overseeing all of MCC Ontario's programs. But his career in the not-for-profit sector goes back nearly 40 years. Interestingly enough, the pivotal experience that set him on his path was a volunteer placement with MCC's Serving and Learning Together program, also known as SALT. Back in episode 18, you can hear me and Undercurrents producer Kristen Kong talk about our respective experiences in the SALT program. Back in the 1980s, though, there was an option to serve domestically, and Rod's placement took him from his home in Vancouver, BC, to Markham, Ontario.
I was matched with an organization that served individuals who were coming out of mental health hospitals at the time. And at that time, individuals needed life skills support to reintegrate because they had largely been hospitalized in a setting where they didn't need to do anything. They didn't need to do their laundry or cook or clean or even know how to walk to the store because these were often closed settings. So my role in MCC was to help people learn those life skills, walk to the store, learn to do recreation in the community and a whole variety of things. And many of the stories they told me, they were coming from a background where they had developmental delays, but they could often share their stories about being incarcerated in these institutions. So it was an eye-opener for me, and it was at a very instrumental time in my career path to start learning about how we work with people who are marginalized in the community and just learning even our own attitudes and beliefs about people who are on the margins.
Peacebuilding even now is sort of a abstract thing. What does that look like? When did you start recognizing your work or that you had an interest professionally in peacebuilding? Like, what did that look like?
I think it started, I was a program director at an organization that was housing people men who were homeless, men and women who had been transitioning through into permanent housing, and people coming out of federal prisons. And It was during that time I was also starting to see a need in the work that I was doing for good human resources management.
I'm not sure what pops into your head when you think of HR, but for Rod, his work in HR was nothing short of a calling. He half-jokingly referred to administration as his spiritual gift. In any case, Rod's role in HR was a challenging yet fertile field in which he could live out peacebuilding in a practical way.
There were lots of situations that I was getting into in my work where I needed to mediate situations that involved a lot of conflict. Particularly, I was involved with union and labor relations issues for the management of one organization. And I can remember on an interpersonal level a situation happening. There was a grievance that was filed against a supervisor, and I was the HR person who was representing the employer. And the union was very upset at this situation, and the union steward that was working with the employee was very angry. I said, you sound really angry. Am I right? And the person kind of barked back at me in a very angry tone and said, I'm not angry. And so we kept talking, and I stayed calm. And about 5 minutes later, the person said, well, maybe I am angry. And so, then that was a whole opening, right, for me to ask them, well, if you're angry, what is it you really need? And we were able to talk about what their concerns were. And in doing that, the steward and the employee went away feeling like they had been heard. They had heard from us, and we resolved that situation in an amicable way. And that's just an example, I think, of remaining in a state of being a non-anxious presence when you're in those types of heated conflict situations. And really reaching out and asking people what they're feeling and what they're needing. Because at our deepest level, that's what people want. They want to know that they're heard.
They want to know they've been heard. You don't have to be in HR or labor relations to put this lesson to work. If you are in any relationship with another human being, this will be useful to you. Nowhere has this lesson been more powerful or hard-won in my life than in my 13 years of marriage and 10 years of parenthood. Time and again, I've had to overcome my instinct to be right or to fix a problem as I see it, and to instead remain a non-anxious presence, to listen as deeply and patiently as I have the energy for, and to acknowledge and repeat back to them what I've heard them say, to make sure I've understood them properly. Just that process alone goes a long way in resolving or easing the tension. Okay. Back to Rod, where he shares about the importance of creativity in peacebuilding.
It really struck me that we have to move from trying to dominate and control situations to try and collaborate more with people. And that takes creativity, particularly when harms happen. People have done things that have hurt people, whether physically or emotionally. So I think to begin, it is really about helping people understand that we're hardwired to see people, especially from other groups, if we're talking about the things we see on the news, as less than human. And I think the important thing is that we do recognize that we are all human, and we all have human tendencies that are and misunderstandings and miscommunication and different perspectives. And so not only just learning not to control or dominate, but learn to collaborate. And if we can go into them in a more non-anxious way, and we can be curious and collaborative and creative, we can ask better questions, and we can find out what people are feeling, what they're needing. We can tell others what we're feeling and needing, and we can go farther when that happens.
Helping someone feel heard, being creative and collaborative, these are great first steps in building peace with one another. You've understood them, you haven't overreacted, you've made them feel heard. But what happens if you don't agree with the other person's perspective? What if you want to change someone's mind?
It can be hard to balance that because we often, in our work of peace building, want to see change and want to see the dial moved. And it takes a lot of time. And I think I have the benefit of now, working for 4 decades with people in all kinds of different situations on different projects and different problems. And I'll give you an example. This happened to me where I was working at the time for an organization, and I had to give regular updates to a regional committee of this municipality on how we were spending the money and how we were helping the homeless. At that time, that city was going through a lot of not in my backyard issues because of the programs and services that we were operating in their local community and in the neighborhood. As a result, they saw proliferation of what they felt was because of this social service that I was managing at the time. In doing this, would have question time from the different counselors that were members of this committee. They were regional counselors. And one regional counselor in particular was very difficult. They asked very difficult questions, very challenging questions. Why aren't the homeless people working? Don't they want to work? And so I would respond with different things like, many of the people that we work with have disabilities, or they don't have the ability at this point in time. They need housing, so they're not in a place that's stable for them to be able to work. And often the staffer would follow me out and apologize for this person's questions because they were quite difficult sometimes. And you kind of knew that the person was getting at more than they were asking. They were trying to trip me up in some way.
Rod, ever the peace builder, is using tactful language, but you've probably heard these same kinds of comments on your social media feed or in the news. But Rod followed his training, kept calm, and answered the questions.
And it wasn't until years later, and this is the benefit of time, right? We don't always know the impact of our actions. And as I happened to be invited, I was in a new job, and I happened to be invited by my boss to attend this gala dinner with them. And this counselor was now the mayor of the town and was at the table. And they said, "Rod, it's good to see you after all these years." And I wasn't sure of what to expect because this person had done and said some difficult things, both publicly and to me, about the work I had been doing in the community. This person said publicly to everyone around the table, "I just want you to know that I've known Rod for a number of years, and he's really changed my mind about homelessness and the whole, the issues surrounding homelessness." What really amazed me was that it can take years to make an impact. I looked at my new boss, the executive director, and he looked over and smiled at me, and it was one of those interesting moments that I never thought I would have.
It takes time. This is both reassuring and frustrating. If you're a listener of Undercurrents, I can assume that you are a conscientious person who wants to make a positive impact in the world. If you've ever been to a political protest or rally, you've probably heard the chant, "What do we want? The thing we want. When do we want it? Now." But Rod's lesson here is that change rarely happens now. In Matthew 13, Jesus gave the parable of the farmer who scattered seeds on rocky soil or among thorny plants, and some on good soil, which bore lots of good fruit. There's a lot of wisdom in this story. I do like to think of conversations we have as seeds we plant. We might not have seen the change or the introspection or the shifting of the needle in that interaction, but it might have planted a seed. The question is, has it landed in good soil, or rocky soil, or weedy soil? Here's where we can dig deeper, if you will. The good news is, As any gardener or farmer can tell you, even poor soil can be rehabilitated to become rich and fertile again. What does that mean for us when we're trying to plant a seed of peace in a thorny relationship? Maybe we need to work in the compost of compassion, or the nutrients of non-anxious presence, or the fertilizer of mutual respect and grace. I'm sure Rod was lamenting the rocky field he was having to till with this combative city councillor, but this story shows that with time, there's hope that good fruit can grow from even the toughest soil. The final story of peacebuilding from Rod is at the highest level yet. He was invited to teach restorative justice principles to leaders of a national prison system in Zambia.
Yeah, in 2019, I got an email from Isa Imbombolo from MCC Zambia. He wondered if I would come to Zambia and teach restorative justice principles and practices to officers and supervisors from the Zambia Correctional Service. The individual officers were handpicked because of their attitudes and behaviors that had been seen in the institution by their supervisors, but also because of the inmates who were in peace clubs. So the inmates who were already doing peace clubs with Isa in the Zambian correctional settings were endorsing these officers to go forward. So they were picked because the Zambia Correctional Service shifted from being a prison service at that time to becoming a correctional service. Now, it doesn't seem like a big shift, but when they changed from Zambia Prison Service to Zambia Correctional Service, they were signaling a change from moving from punitive, a very colonial system that was passed down through their history when they started institutional prisons, to looking at these institutions as being more restorative and more rehabilitative.
Just a couple of quick points. One, I love the shout out to Isa Ebombolo, who is an absolute legend in the peacebuilding and MCC world in Africa and beyond. The peace clubs that he started in schools in Zambia have spread across Africa and even come to Canada. And secondly, how cool is it that the Zambian prisoners themselves were consulted in naming which officers would be a good fit for the restorative justice training? This is already a sign of restorative principles being put into practice. I asked Rod where and how these restorative justice seeds were planted. It turns out that part of the answer is in the handmade comforters that MCC volunteers make by the tens of thousands every year.
There was one of the top leaders came to Canada a number of years ago and visited Grand Valley Institution for Women, and visited, so was local to Kitchener, but also had visited some other prisons in Canada because they wanted to explore this restorative system that's more restorative than what they were doing. And in doing that, they got involved with MCC through the blanket making program, and blankets started going into the prison in Zambia. And that's what started this commissioner getting interested in MCC and what else MCC had to offer, and found out about our peace building, our restorative justice program, our work with inmates, and our work with people being rehabilitated and coming out and re-entering the community and doing that safely.
Ironically, modern restorative justice and victim offender reconciliation programs that originated in Canada have had a hard time surviving here, as federal funding has been unreliable. As of this writing, funding for many restorative justice programs has been cut entirely, resulting in the closure of many RJ programs, including MCC's. However, the legacy of this good work lives on around the world, including in Zambia.
It was an amazing experience for the length of time that I was there. I was there a very short amount of time, and in that time I really saw how receptive this group of people was to engaging in restorative principles, practices, and restorative dialogue. We did a lot of role playing, and so they practiced how to do this, because these were the people that were then going to be the restorative justice and peacebuilding unit for over 60 prisons across Zambia. So these individuals were trained, and there was at the end of the week, there was the media was there, and they launched the restorative justice and peacebuilding unit. And I came back to Ontario, and I continued to do some teaching online. The next stage of the project was equipping 4 of their college lecturers to begin to be able to train this program to every new recruit within the Zambia Correctional Service. I just heard from Zambia Correctional Service. I was on a webinar recently that they've done over 2,400 victim offender reconciliation meetings, and have had an incredible amount of success just having individuals reintegrate back into the community after doing these meetings with people that they've harmed.
The seed of restorative justice and peacebuilding has borne fruit in Zambia, and in a kind of pollination of peace, the restorative justice programming has spread to neighboring Malawi's correctional service as well. Also, both Zambia and Malawi's correctional services have adapted the materials to include their respective traditional indigenous ways of thinking to truly make it authentic. Thank you to Rod for sharing with us a few stories from his many years of peacebuilding. We learned that a non-anxious, deep listening posture is helpful in diffusing conflict. We learned that peacebuilding, and particularly changing someone's mind, can take time. A seed that's planted even in the best soil doesn't sprout overnight. And finally, in Rod's story from Zambia, we've learned how once that seed of peace has sprouted, it can spread and cross-pollinate, which is hopeful. We need to hear these stories of hope too. I want to finish with some action items, or action questions. My colleague Scott Morton-Inomia, who leads our Indigenous Neighbors program, talks about truth and reconciliation work in 3 stages of increasing scope. Starting with change perspective. That's the internal work each of us does when we learn something new. The second stage is change relationship. That's when what we've learned changes the relationships around us, and how do we relate differently to others. And the third stage is changing systems. How do we then harness our changed selves, our changed relationships, to then change the systems to be more peaceful and just for all? So in light of these 3 lenses, let me ask you this. Was there something from today's episode that changed your perspective? Or maybe it affirmed something for you that you already knew? Now, taking this new learning or reminder, is there someone in your life you need to relate to differently? Maybe a friend or family member whom you love and want to get along with, but there are some wedge issues that are driving you apart. Could you seek to understand them and maybe plant a small seed, understanding that it will take gentle, loving watering and maybe a lot of time to bear fruit? And 3, what system are you a part of that needs changing? We don't have to go all the way to the federal policy level. It could be a workplace. Maybe you are in HR like Rod used to be, and there's a way to make your workplace more compassionate and generous. Maybe you have other suggestions. Leave them in the comments on your podcast app or on YouTube, wherever you find this. I also want to let you know that there is a discussion guide with each episode that you can find in the show notes or on the website. That's an easy adult education hour at church right there for you. Undercurrents is sponsored in part by Kindred Credit Union. This episode was produced with help from Kristen Kong, artwork by Jesse Bergen, and theme music by Brian McMillan. Executive produced by Sandra Reimer. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Rate and review Undercurrents wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode in 2 weeks. My name is Ken Ogasawara. Have a great rest of your day.